one of the things that Democrats are struggling with right now is that a lot of us want to change people's opinions on Donald Trump. We want to change people's opinions on what's happening. And that's really hard, and we don't know how to do it. And I think you saw in the last election results that our efforts to do it have not been successful so far. That Donald Trump got a majority of the votes of people in this country for the first time. That he got more votes than Democrats did, um, and that has freaked a lot of people out, and it has made us very unsure of what's happening in the country.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to a new episode of Power and Flower. I am Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what's going on in U.S. politics. We also care deeply about pastries. One of the topics we've been following and occasionally commenting on here is what the Democratic resistance to the Trump administration's agenda looks like. So if you were watching Trump's speech last week before a joint session of Congress, you know that Democratic resistance comes in lots of different shapes and sizes, often all at the same time. Very few of them seem particularly effective. You know, you had some people standing up, some people boycotting, some people walking out, some people wearing pink and holding up little signs. There seemed to be very little collective action going on. And this is something that I've been harping on a little bit over the last few weeks, is that Democrats seem to be trying to follow public opinion instead of guiding or molding it. That is, they're really concerned about what polls said about why they lost last year. They're concerned about what polls are going to like next year when they're up for re-election. And so they're adhering to that rather than trying to shape what people think. I had a piece up at my newsletter Tusk last week, which I'll link to, that was on this topic. But today we're going to talk about just what that looks like, the distinction between following and changing public opinion, and whether parties or political actors can shape these things rather than just respond to them. One example I just wanted to start with was just thinking about how Donald Trump can affect how people think about issues. So we've seen over the course of his political career, he will take a viewpoint that was not necessarily a standard Republican viewpoint. And once he takes it, a lot of people in his party will just follow it. So he started saying around 2016 that Vladimir Putin was a good guy, actually. And we saw Republicans' views about Putin actually improved while Democrats didn't. Same with Kanye West, when Trump had sort of an alliance with him for a little while, when Republicans started thinking better of him. More recently, we've seen Democrats becoming more favorable toward Ukraine and Republicans becoming less so in response to things that have happened at the national and international level. So, okay, John, I guess I'm going to throw this to you at this point. You have done in your work a lot of measuring of public opinion, and I'm curious just what your impression on this whole topic is. Can voters be steered? Can public opinion be manufactured or guided? And if so, like in what areas, on what kinds of issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's an important distinction we need to make right off the top of the bat, which is that yes, public opinion can absolutely be changed. It's hard, but there are two very different ways that public opinion is changed, and it's worth defining them and thinking about them differently, because I do think it's going to affect the rest of this conversation. I think the first is what you've been talking about on actually changing people's opinions, right? That, the best example I can think of is on the gay marriage fight, where a lot of people who thought gay marriage was immoral or wrong changed their opinion to think that gay marriage was good and right. And that was led by politicians in many ways. Politicians followed for a while. Public opinion was moving and moving. Politicians in the Democratic Party, especially Barack Obama, with Joe Biden's guidance, God bless Joe Biden for this, when public opinion got to a certain level, politicians got on board, and then public opinion shifted much more dramatically. We saw this especially with African American voters after Barack Obama came out and endorsed marriage equality. The issue changed pretty clearly with voters. So that's one way of doing it. The other way, which is much easier, and which I think Republicans have been terrific at for a long time, is changing the salience of issues, right? Like at any given moment, voters care about hundreds of issues, and they put some of them at the top of the agenda and some at the bottom. The way that elite opinion shapers, so it's politicians, columnists, reporters, academics, the elite public opinion shapers can really change the salience of these issues, right? So the best way to think about this is immigration. When election seasons start, immigration tends to be a low salience issue. People are more worried about the economy. They're more worried about jobs. They're more worried about prices and healthcare and everything else. And then as the election season goes on, you'll see immigration just click up and up and up in the salience people give it. Republicans have gotten very good at this. 2010 was a good example. If you look at polls on immigration, it went from an important issue to 8% of the population in January to 40% of the population in November. They do this with their media apparatus, right? Like the Fox News embedded people following the caravans coming through Mexico is perfect example of how they shape public opinion and move the salience of that up. You do see it on the Democratic side. I think in the last couple election cycles, a lot of Dem campaign efforts have been at increasing the salience of abortion, which is an issue that it is difficult to change people's minds about abortion. It's hard to take a pro-choice person to make them pro-life or a pro-life person to make them pro-choice, but it is very easy to change how important they think that issue is. Pre-Dobbs, there were a lot of people who agreed with Democrats on the issue, but who did not put much value on that, so that they were happy to vote for Republicans because of economics or because of social issues or because of cultural issues, even though they were pro-choice. And Democrats put a lot of work into increasing the salience to make it harder for those voters to vote against their own stated opinion. So I think one of my reactions to your piece, which I highly encourage everybody to read, I thought it was great and thought-provoking,
Thank you.
is that one of the things that Democrats are struggling with right now is that a lot of us want to change people's opinions on Donald Trump. We want to change people's opinions on what's happening. And that's really hard, and we don't know how to do it. And I think you saw in the last election results that our efforts to do it have not been successful so far, that Donald Trump got a majority of the votes of people in this country for the first time.
Plurality.
Plurality, right?
Okay.
He got more votes than Democrats did.
Yes.
And that has freaked a lot of people out, and it has made us very unsure of what's happening in the country. And so because we can't see a path toward changing people's opinion on the issue that matters most, I think we have not done a very good job of trying to change the salience of the issues that we can win on, right? And I think this is where I disagree with some parts of your piece. I don't think things are as dire as your piece lays out, because I do think the issues that Democrats can win on are Social Security and Medicaid, right? That I don't know that we win by making people feel like the sky is falling on everything. I certainly don't think we win on defending public employees, which I wish that we could. I think that public employees are great. I wish that public employees were an issue that we could rally the country behind us on. I really wish that USAID funding was an issue we could rally the country behind. I don't know that it is. I do think that Republican attacks on Social Security and Medicaid are going to be really good for us. I think part of why you see the Republicans denying that they are cutting Medicaid, even though all but one of them took a vote to cut Medicaid, is because I think they know that too.
Okay, that is interesting, and I agree with you. Like, we're talking about a lot of issues where people don't necessarily have a lot of hard opinions, except when it comes to things like Social Security and Medicaid or Medicare, where people react very strongly to what they perceive as cuts. I wanted to ask about what you were talking about, and I think it's a very important distinction between changing people's views and then changing the salience, rather, not telling people what to think, but telling people what to think about.
Exactly.
I was curious about, and this is something that I think Republicans have been very successful on in recent decades, was like reframing an issue to sort of connect it to people and have them change the way they're thinking of it. So like a number of years ago, when there was debate in Congress about getting rid of or dramatically reforming the estate tax, there was a big effort by congressional Republicans to don't call it an estate tax, call it a death tax. And then which makes it a lot less popular. And then to bring the focus on like family farms and talk about how, this will, if you have a multi-million-dollar family farm, this cuts into your ability to pass on your farm to your children when you've rightly built it up. Now, the number of people who are actually family farmers in this country is not large, but like that was something that resonated for people in a way that like the estate tax did not. Or even the recent focus on like, demonizing trans people. Trans people were, have not been a particularly popular minority But not that many people were really up for attacking them until, like, the Republican focus became, let's focus on women athletes and the
Right.
unfairness of them having to compete against trans people. And suddenly that is something that more
Republicans
people resonate.
famously supportive of women's sports.
Yeah,
You
and
can't
yeah,
get to a WNBA game for all the Republican fans of the audience.
right. And, like, by the way, there are fewer than 10 openly trans women competing in college
Yeah.
athletics right now, but, like,
And
they
most
turned
of
that. Yeah.
and none of them are the champions, which I think is
Right.
like the woman
Right.
who's constantly testifying for Republicans about how unfair it is to compete against trans people lost to 4 cis women, right? And
Yes.
tied
Okay.
the trans woman.
That this is just this one thing kept.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Had a right to be a champion.
exactly.
So, but yeah, so I'm curious about, like, how you see that. Is that an area that Democrats have been successful in as well? Do you see opportunities
Yeah,
there?
I think it is an area that we have been successful to some degree. I think going back to gay marriage, right? Like marriage equality is a better testing message than gay marriage or phrase than gay marriage. When
Hmm.
you can make and that is a rhetorical frame that we were able to shift people into. Um, I think that on abortion as an issue, thinking about people as pro-choice rather than pro-abortion obviously makes a difference. You can see how fraught all of the language around abortion is. People, on both sides know what their successful framing is and what isn't very successful. You see very few people on the Democratic side defending abortion. Very few people will call themselves pro-abortion, although some have. There's been some effort to move the window that way. But yeah, I think it's easy to do those polls and to get that message discipline. And I think it matters a bit on the margins. I think and we've talked a little bit around the trans issue. I think it's worth, focusing in closely on that. Republicans have lost the argument on most parts of trans. Like most people believe that trans people deserve respect, they deserve the right to be happy, they deserve to be mostly left alone. Part of what Republicans have done successfully is they found the softest part of the underbelly. And I've done a lot of research on trans issues. I have been lucky and blessed to work with a lot of trans colleagues to do a lot of research on this. And we have known for a decade that the hardest part, we could win on non-discrimination laws, we could win on bathroom access, we could win on a lot of things that we care about, and that sports is the hardest one.
Uh,
Right, that Americans love sports, that we love, we take it seriously. We think the idea of fairness is deeply embedded in what Americans care about, and that the idea of someone declaring that they are female and competing with female athletes has always been something that we have known would be a really difficult thing to message around. I think you've seen, Gavin Newsom this week. I think you'll see a lot of other Democrats sort of say, look, if we can get 80% of what we want for trans rights, we will take it, rather than, staking ourselves to 100%, when, to be totally blunt, there are no good arguments for us on this. The best argument that we have on trans sports is that you shouldn't care about this, that there are 10 people in the NCAA who are trans women who are competing, that this does not matter. Like, that's the best argument we have. And it is really hard to tell a voter that they shouldn't care about something that they care about.
mhm.
And so I don't think that Gavin Newsom is the last Democrat you're going to see say, look, trans rights are important. The right of trans people to be happy is important. The right to not be fired, to love who you love, to have housing, to have education, to have all of these things. And in order to protect that, we might say that the sports issue is something that we are willing to let local communities decide on, right? And I think you're going to see more of that happening. I think it's unfortunate for the trans people who I love. I think it's a logical reaction to where public opinion is, that at some point, the argument of you shouldn't care is just a hard one to carry.
Mm, okay. I take your point on that. I want to ask about the role of, I guess, party leadership here. I mentioned a couple of examples where, like, when Trump changed his minds on something, a lot of other Republicans do too. There's so there's a very good book a little over a decade ago by a political scientist named Gabriel Lenz, a book called "Follow the Leader." I'll post a link to that. Um, where Lenz did something really interesting. He was trying to understand, like, how people make up their mind about which candidate to support in an election. And basically saying, do people form opinions about policy and then, like, pick the candidate who's closest to their views on that policy? And basically he did uh these 3-wave survey opinion surveys, and found that it's kind of the opposite. that people pick the candidate they like, and then they will change their views on policy to match those of the candidate. And it was, and like he found examples of this with like George W. Bush and his views on Social Security in 2000. That like people are more interested in the candidate, and I think like Trump has been a great example of this, where
Yeah.
there's a lot of people who are very more interested in the candidate, and then will modify their views. Um, there was I also want to mention my graduate school mentor John Zoller at UCLA. His famous book from a little more than 30 years ago now, Nature and Origin of Mass Opinions. He builds on a lot of literature about how most people don't really have very well defined beliefs on most issues. Um, they can get a signal though from party leaders, from elites, from people, politicians, and journalists they trust, that can guide them on those issues. But the catch is that like the more politically astute people are less likely to change their minds because they know a lot more about policy. And the less people who follow politics less are more open to these new messages, but they're less likely to hear them in the first place. But like
Right.
a loud signal from someone like Trump, can get to them and help them change their mind. So I wanted to ask, like, first of all, is there, Trump may be a really unusual figure here, but is there someone like that who influences Democrats? Is that something Democrats should be working toward? What do
Yeah.
you see here?
Uh, I think that I mean, the best recent example was Obama when he was president, right?
Hmm.
Like, I think he was able to shape Democratic opinion on a wide variety of things. I think some of the progressive frustration with Obama is that, to a lot of people on the left, he didn't go far. He had the ability to do things and he didn't push Democrats as far as they may have wished that he would have. I think the most interesting example right now is Bernie Sanders. Bernie has a ton of popularity. He has he's currently, and God bless him for doing this, I think it's incredible. He's on a tour of congressional districts in the Midwest with Republican members of Congress, talking about what's happening, where he's drawing huge overflow crowds in Wisconsin and in Michigan, and I think it's exactly what Democrats should be doing. He also has a sort of idiosyncratic set of issue positions, right? Like he had an A from the NRA for a long time. Historically, he has been less pro-immigration than the Democratic caucus. The issues that he cares about are not the exact sort of generic Democratic brand. It'll be interesting to see if he starts trying to push the larger party, which of course he's not actually technically a member of, but in one direction or another, and if voters follow him there. I don't think he's going to run for president in 2028, but it's clear that he wants to have an important voice in that process. And I think the issue matrix that he chooses to focus on will get a lot of people's attention, and we'll push it in that way.
Well, just to jump in on that, like I think Sanders is a really interesting figure in this regard, as you point out. Like this is something that's very much within his skill set, right? He's not always like a great legislator in terms of crafting bills, but he's really good at barnstorming around the country, generating a sort of a sense of passion about a range of issues, and developing some kind of mass movement on the left. I don't know if we even want to call it within the Democratic Party, but it can definitely have an effect on other Democrats.
Look, and
And yeah.
but I also think that Bernie is a great example of some of the challenges that Democrats have here, and I think it's worth identifying all the ways that Democrats are different than Republicans in this. I think the first one is, the right wing media apparatus, right wing intellectuals exist to prop up the Republican Party, right, and have done that whether they agree with the nominee or not, right. That a lot of people right now will tell you that they never liked George W. Bush and that he was, a soft blah 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 blah, but like at the time they defended him, the progressive left, the media infrastructure, intellectuals, people like Bernie Sanders attack the Democratic Party all the time, right? That like Bernie isn't a Democrat. He refuses to be a Democrat. He makes a clear point of saying, I am different than the Democratic Party, which, he has every right to do. But one of the challenges that Democrats have in this is that, the right wing exists to prop up the conservative party, the left wing exists to attack the Democratic Party. And so you have this difficult tension of what are we supposed to do here, right? That if the loudest and most dynamic voices and the people with the broadest reach, particularly outside of the most engaged voters, are telling you that Democrats are bad, it is difficult for Democrats to get that message through. And so I think this is a large scale problem that I do not know how to solve. But I would love if Bernie Sanders would call himself a Democrat, and I would love if he would say everybody who agrees with me should call themselves Democrats, because I do think it matters. And I think that um, we have people all, the candidate who ran in Nebraska, Don Osborne, who came closer than he would have if he called himself a Democrat. There are a lot of people who want to replicate that model of have the Democrats stand down, run independents, do our best to try to, weasel out some. I think it's a rational response. I think if you're somebody who cares about the long-term health of the party, it's really concerning that we need people to think of the Democratic Party as a place that they are welcome, even if they only agree with 70% of what the average Democrat believes. And right now we have a lot of elite leaders cueing them that is a bad idea, and I wish that we could find a way to change it.
Hmm. So, a question for you, like, let's imagine for a second that, like, Democrats during the Trump speech before Congress last week, let's say they actually had been very organized. Either they had done like a big walkout, or they'd done some sort of sustained rising up and protesting and forcing them to throw them out of the chamber, and like, they'd actually made some noise. What is the goal there? Now, we recognize that, like, Democrats are not in a majority here.
Right.
They're not going to be able to, like, necessarily change votes or change the administration's behavior. Is the idea just they could make the Trump administration less popular more quickly? Is it to put pressure on Republican members of Congress in swing districts and maybe even guide elections that way? Like, what could they theoretically be doing?
So I think they came to the conclusion that nothing, and that's why they
Okay.
didn't do it. Right. I think
Okay.
whether you want to agree with that or not, I think that, one of the interesting things happened in 2025, excuse me, vis-a-vis what happened in the first Trump administration, is that I think we look at what happened in the first Trump administration now as a failure, right? That we went around telling everyone that the sky was falling. We went around crying wolf. And the end result was that 8 years later, the majority of the sheep voted for the wolf, or a plurality of the sheep voted for the wolf. And I think that a lot of Democrats look at what we did back then as not being successful, in part because we were sort of constantly hair on fire, constantly the world was ending. One thing you heard a ton from voters in the 2024 election is, well, Democrats are saying that Trump wants to cut Social Security, he wants to cut Medicare, he wants to deport millions of people, but they said that 8 years ago and he didn't do any of it,
Mhm.
right? That we had a much harder time being believed by voters this time, because we had said a bunch of stuff that ended up not happening. And some of that was because the legal challenges were successful. Some of that was because, John McCain voted against Obamacare repeal. There are a lot of reasons why the Trump administration in the first term was not able to do what they said they wanted to do. Some of it was Democratic resistance, but what that added up to was an inability to convince voters this time around that it mattered. So I think that there is a not irrational position on Democrats that we have to hold our fire for when it matters the most, right? And I
Mm.
think it'll be very interesting to see with the continuing resolution vote this week in Congress, if this is a point where, Hakeem Jeffries didn't want to make a scene during the not quite State of the Union, but wants to make sure that he gets 100% Democrats voting no. And, that may be a pretty logical solution in the long run,
Mm.
to focus less on the theatrics and more on the substance. I don't know if that's actually a mistake. I think it's worth zooming out a little bit and thinking there are three major constituencies that Democratic elected officials care about right now. Right, the first is the base voters who elect them in primaries, and those folks, a plurality of them are saying they want the party to become more moderate. For the first time in a long time, it's up 11 points over the last year. It was in the low 30s of people who wanted the Democratic Party to be more moderate. It's now 46% of Democrats, according to the Gallup polling. Right, so there is a very real effort of core Democratic voters to move toward the center, to move toward, people want to win elections and they think that that's important. I think the second group that Democratic electeds really care about are donors. And a lot of donors want the government to work. A lot of Democratic base voters want the government to work. They think that that is a priority of theirs. You have a lot of donors who want the government to work. And the third group they care about are elite opinion havers, right? Columnists, grassroots leaders, folks, and that third group wants the theatrics, they want the show, they want the unified, they want the walkout, they want everybody joining with Al Green and shouting at the president. But that's only a third of the kinds of voices that matter to Dems right now. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how the leadership chooses to move this, because I think you're absolutely right that ultimately this is a question of leadership, right? That you would need a person to say, "Hey, Dems, we're going to do this," and have everyone listen to them. And there isn't anyone who can do that. And
So on
the
that,
people who, sorry, yeah.
Well, on that topic, I wanted to ask you. We had Boris Hirsink on the show a few weeks ago to talk about his recent book on basically the leaders of the DNC and the RNC and like the role that they have played historically. Ken Martin is a relatively new chair of the DNC. Like, is this someone who could be playing more of a role in like steering Democrats? Or is that not something we should be expecting from like the head of the DNC?
I don't think it's something you should expect from the head of the DNC. And I say this as someone who's worked at the DNC 3 times and deeply admires that organization and admires Ken Martin. Like, that no one voted for Ken Martin, right? No actual vote. Obviously, 447 members of the DNC voted for Ken Martin, but no primary voters voted for him. And so I don't think it's a role that the DNC should be playing. I think importantly, it's not a role that the members of Congress think that the DNC should be playing, right? Like the 10 Democrats who voted to censure Al Green, I don't think any of them stopped to think about what Ken Martin's thoughts on that were before they took that vote, right? They're responding to these other positions. I do think it's potentially a role for the caucus leadership. I've been frustrated with the caucus leadership. I think a lot of Democrats have. I understand that they have a really difficult job. But I think it's easy to see all the corniness. It's easy to see all the sort of ineffectual stuff, the auction paddles, all this sort of silliness, and really wish that we had a stronger position. I do think ultimately Democratic votes on policy matter more. If Hakeem Jeffries succeeds in getting every Democrat to vote against this terrible continuing resolution that is not a continuing resolution, but that strips a lot of funding out, I think that will matter a lot more than, what happened at the State of the Union. That, I didn't watch the speech that Trump gave because I was being kind to myself. I watched some of the reactions afterward, though, and there were serious people talking about how what Al Green did was going to impact the midterm elections, and I knew it was time to log off. That we are so far away from the midterm elections. There's so much that's going to happen between now and then that if anyone remembers who stood up and yelled at the president in 2025, in 2026, I will eat my hat. Like
if
seems,
they remember that next
wild.
week, I'll be amazed. Honestly,
I'm honestly surprised we are talking about it today, a full, not even a week after it happened. So yeah, I think that what's going to matter is the Democrats can say we stood together to protect Social Security and Medicare. And a lot of people on the left are going to get very bored with that messaging. I think it's worth pointing out that the stuff that influences voters who matter often doesn't do a thing for the people who are the noisiest. So we're going to see until next November and well beyond the loudest progressive voices saying the Democrats are idiots who are fumbling this election because they're not saying whatever dream thing that they want them to say. Those are also voters whose whose votes are not in question, who ultimately don't add up to a path to victory. Actual voters are really clear that the things they care about, I think Democrats need to be really focused on those, and where we can increase the salience of the issues that we went on, we need to. And I think there's a lot of Democrats who feel that all the work that was done to increase the salience of abortion in the last election was a mistake. I've been hearing this a lot in the clients that I'm talking to and the debriefs that I'm going to, that there's this, hey, you told us to talk about abortion and we did, and then we lost. So why weren't we talking about egg prices, or why weren't we talking about something else? I actually think that's wrong. I think that if we had not been talking about abortion, things would have been worse. I think that we need to keep talking about abortion because it is an issue where, the vast majority of voters are with us. It's just not at the top of their issue agenda, and we have to keep pushing them up and up the salience meter.
Yeah. It's funny with like issues that will, wax and wane like that. I remember in Colorado, I think it was in 2008 that Mark Udall first got elected to the Senate, largely by talking about abortion. And he focused on that, and it turned out a lot of people. And then he did the same thing when he was running for re-election in 2014, and he lost. And they mocked him. They called him Mark Uterus because he was too focused on abortion. It's like, maybe it didn't have that much to do with abortion in the first place, but or maybe it would have been worse if he hadn't talked about that.
But yeah,
But
didn't the Denver Post endorse a Republican in part because they said that Mark Udall's talking about abortion was irrelevant?
yeah, he's talking about it too much.
Yeah.
So anyway, well, let's pivot here. Speaking of opinion, I have an opinion that this time of year is particularly good for baked goods. We have
Yes.
two important holidays in March, St. Patrick's Day and Purim, which have their own baked goods associated with them. And I know you've been doing some experimentation along these lines. I wanted to,
Yes.
what have you been baking lately?
So I made a delicious Guinness cake this past weekend. My family is 15/16 Irish. The one ancestor I have who wasn't Irish gave me his last name, but everybody else is Irish. And my partner's family is mostly Irish. And so we went over to my future in-laws this weekend, and I made a Guinness cake. I used Nigella Lawson's recipe, which we can I'll send a link for the notes. It's a British recipe, which is always complicated to try to figure out what on earth, like double cream is not a thing you can find in the grocery store. Corn flour is not a thing you can find in the grocery store. You got to do a lot of translation, but it's a phenomenal cake. It's a cooked batter. So the butter is melted. Everything it ends up with this sort of beautifully dense cake. The recipe directions talk about the magnificent fudgy blackness of it, and it's absolutely right. But it makes a beautiful cake, and then a cream cheese frosting that I'm bad at making frosting smooth, so I always look for things where it's supposed to be chaotic, and you're supposed to make the frosting look like the head of a pint of Guinness, which means that I don't have to make it perfect. I can make it chaotic. So that was very successful. So that's definitely in the St. Patrick's Day tradition. Yeah, I think one of the things about being an Irish American who loves to cook and bake is that there aren't very many good things to make in the Irish tradition. Irish food is bad, and Irish baked goods are bad. Soda bread is terrible. Cornbread is disgusting. Or corned beef is disgusting, right? Like it's a hard thing to find. So this Guinness cake is an important part of my March repertoire.
I will defend both corned beef and soda bread, although it's possible I'm used to the Jewish versions of them, which is
which are better, which are definitely better. My mother, God bless her, didn't love to cook, but I remember she used to corn a beef around St. Patrick's Day, and it would make the whole house smell like corning beef, and it's pretty dramatic.
Okay. Thank you for this. Excellent. Okay.
Sorry, and you're getting ready for Purim, right? And what's the tradition around baking for that?
So the main pastry for Purim is a hamantash. It's a triangular cookie. It's basically a pastry with a fruit filling, or you could often like
poppy seeds, right?
Poppy seed is a popular one. That's not my favorite. My favorite is the prune. I don't eat a lot of prunes, but prune in this cookie works really well. Also, you could just do like strawberry, apricot. Those are usually delicious as well. And it's been a few years since I made them, but they're not terribly hard to make. And so I'm going to hopefully put a batch together at some point later this week.
Excellent.
And I will post a photo of the last time I tried to make them, because some of them came out fairly well. I recall it was during the COVID shutdown. It was something I could focus on, during online department meetings. So it was a good, nice, mindless task to focus on.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. This has been extremely helpful. I'll post as many links as I can to all the things we've been discussing today. But yeah, thanks for this.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks all for listening, and we hope to have something up for you soon. Everyone stay safe. Thank you for listening to this episode of Power and Flour. This episode was produced by Eli Maskett. We encourage you to follow and rate this podcast wherever you listen to it. Watch for new episodes at the end of each week.